everybody. Welcome everyone to today's John Cain lunch. Hope you've enjoyed your lunch. My name is Meredith Eldridge. I'm the Director of Operations and Communications at Capita. Wessa sends her apologies. She's not able to make it today because she's currently overseas. On behalf of everyone here, I would like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the lands that we meet on, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and also to the traditional owners of the lands around Australia where our online viewers are joining us from. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Philip Mendes. Philip teaches social policy and the welfare state and community practice and is the Director of the Social Inclusion and Social Policy Research Unit in the Department of Social Work at Monash University. His research areas include the life experiences of young and older adults who grew up in forms of out-of-home care, welfare conditionality, medically supervised injecting facilities, and social workers and policy practice. He's the author or co-author of 14 books. And today he's here to discuss his newest book, From Resistance to Reform, Case Studies of Long-Term Social Justice Advocacy in Australia. Please welcome Professor Philip Mendes.
Always forget to turn the mic on. Thank you, Meredith, and welcome to everyone. Great to see so many friends, colleagues, even family members here. Really, really good. So today I'm going to talk about the book, about the main content of the book, and go from there. So I think it's fair to say many policy frameworks and theories talk about why existing or amended policies have worked or not worked, but there is very little examination comparatively of policy failure, and particularly why many inadequate policies are retained for long periods of time, despite the availability of significant evidence in favour of alternative policy directions that are likely to advance better outcomes. So in the book, what I've done is presented a case study approach interrogating 4 policy areas where very long-term resistance to policy reform was finally overcome by a combination of factors, including strong domestic and/or global research evidence, ideological changes within major political parties and governments, and effective mobilisation campaigns by informed stakeholders and advocates, including lived experience voices. So the 4 case studies of Australian social policy in the book are as follows. 1, young people transitioning from out-of-home care. So all 8 Australian states and territories have now extended out-of-home care program supports and funding from 18 to 21 years of age. Sounds pretty straightforward and pretty obvious, but it took a long, long time. So young people transitioning from forms of out-of-home care, whether foster care, kinship care, or residential group out-of-home care, are a very vulnerable group internationally. Many experience volatile transitions to adulthood, resulting in limited life chances and opportunities. Some experience homelessness, poor mental health, and involvement in the criminal justice system. A disproportionate number of care leavers in Australia come from First Nations backgrounds, which is also the case in Canada and New Zealand. Now, there's actually been public awareness in Australia since 1989. So do the maths. That's 36 years ago. The Burdekin report, the Human Rights Report into Homelessness, found that care leavers were disproportionately represented in that youth homeless population. And there's been considerable scholarly research evidence as to the failures of existing policies and the urgent need for policy and practice reform. In particular, numerous studies have demonstrated that it is not adequate to cease financial support to that group of young people once they turn 18 years or even younger, and to expect them to suddenly transition to self-reliant adulthood without any of the ongoing family and community supports that most of their non-peers in the community now receive till at least 25 years or older. Yet it was only in response to the home stretch advocacy campaign to lift the transition age from 18 to 21 years, which commenced in 2016, so fairly recently, that all 8 Australian states and territories finally introduced by 2022 extended care supports to care leavers till 21 years of age. So case study 2, the medically supervised injecting room in Victoria. That being the first ever injecting room in Victoria and only the second ever injecting room in Australia. So medically supervised injecting rooms, they're legally approved facilities where people who inject drugs can inject substances such as heroin or methamphetamine in relative safety under the supervision of medically trained personnel. More than 100 injecting rooms have been introduced in 60 cities internationally based on research evidence that they are an effective harm reduction method for preventing overdose-related injury and death and enhancing public amenity. But their introduction in Australia has been subject to ongoing political and ideological contention, which has still continued in the last week, even in Victoria. Now, the first Australian injecting room was established in King's Cross way back in 2001. There were multiple evaluations of that room, all of which said it was doing a good job, doing the job it had been funded to do. And the New South Wales government, it was actually a coalition government, made that room permanent in 2011. The Victorian path has been much less smooth. So a Victorian Labor government headed by Steve Bracks back in 2000 actually proposed the introduction of injecting rooms in 5 areas in Melbourne, but their introduction was blocked by a Conservative majority in the upper house of the then state parliament. Despite ongoing campaigns for injecting rooms in areas of high heroin-related overdoses by a coalition of health and welfare professionals, progressive politicians and local governments and residents, it wasn't until 2018 that a state Labor government did what at the time was a massive policy backflip and introduced an injecting room in the city of Yarra. An official review in 2023 then established that room as a permanent program in Yarra and also recommended that a second room be established in the central business district. Yet the Victorian Labor government later decided under another premier, a new premier, not to introduce that second injecting room. Okay, case study 3, the job seeker payment for the unemployed. So the big change here was that in a period of 3 years, both coalition and Labor governments federally introduced an increase in the job seeker rate. Now, this debate has been an ongoing debate in Australia and virtually across global north countries. Should social security payments for able-bodied adults not in the paid labour market, although of course we know that a lot of people on job seeker actually have a lot of casual and paid work, but irrespective, should the main aim to be enable that group to live above the poverty line, or should the main aim to be to give them incentives to, excuse me, to participate in the workforce, well, the paid workforce. So in Australia, I guess a combination of neoliberal views, but also a wider view, often held very widely in the labour movement, that paid work should be the preferred form of sustenance, so to speak, has increasingly favoured a lower rate for at least 3 decades. So since 1997, the job seeker rate has progressively declined compared to the pension rates due to different forms of indexation, and it has also become much lower as a proportion of the average wage. So Australia currently has the second lowest replacement rate for the newly unemployed as a percentage of previous wage earnings in the whole OECD. So we're not leading the way as government sometimes boast, we're actually holding up the bottom of the ladder. And there is evidence that, importantly, many unemployed people experience severe poverty. So there's been a number of advocacy campaigns, particularly in the last 15 years, to lift the job seeker rate, particularly by ACOS, the peak welfare body, and other anti-poverty groups. And those campaigns, I guess, have argued both that a rate increase is necessary, one, to relieve poverty, but also, two, to actually help the unemployed to find work, to give them the resources to look for work, to travel, to contact, to network, and so on. And also that an increase can be funded by additional revenue from taxation or other savings. But until 2020, both Labor governments and coalition governments federally said, no, we are not going to lift the rate, and rejected research evidence in favour of doing so. Then the coalition government very abruptly introduced a major temporary increase in the rate in early 2020 during COVID, and later legislated a small permanent increase in April 2021. And then the newly elected Labor government introduced a further small increase in September 2023. But there has been no further rate increases since that time, despite the fact that the Labor government's own Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, now a statutory body, constantly reports in their submissions, this is what we need to do urgently. Case study 4, the abolition of the cashless debit card, which became a bit of an obsession of mine for a long time, I've got to admit. So the Commonwealth government, the Labor government, abolished the cashless debit card, which was the harshest example of welfare quarantining in Australia. Now, forms of conditional welfare where receipt of an eligibility for social security payments is tied to changes in behaviour have become increasingly prevalent globally in recent years. Although I've got to say Australia went well beyond everybody else, which is, I think, an important thing to be aware of. So from 2007 onwards, again, there was bipartisan agreement federally, both coalition governments and Labor governments introduced forms of conditional welfare, initially the basics card, mainly in the NT, although that got extended across 5 other areas, and then the cashless debit card. And all these forms of compulsory income management involved a quarantining of somewhere between 50 to 90% of a person's benefit payment, which was held over for spending on food or rent or other essential items. Quarantine funds couldn't be spent on prohibited goods and services such as alcohol and gambling. Oddly, some of the quarantine funds could be used on tobacco and some couldn't be, so the logic here is just not there. So the aim of compulsory income management with a basics card, cashless debit card or the current card in the NT is to reduce the impact of antisocial behaviour associated with the lead substance use and problem gambling on individuals, families, particularly children and communities. As of late last year, there were still 31,000 people on a form of compulsory income management, of whom the great majority were First Nations Australians living in the NT. Now, compulsory income management has been subject to ongoing political, ideological and methodological contention, particularly, but not solely, around individual versus structural definitions of disadvantage. Multiple evaluations, both official, independent and everywhere, have questioned whether it was ever effective in meeting its objectives, and also whether social costs such as shame and stigma outweighed any gains around reduced substance use. Other concerns included, not surprisingly, its disproportionate impact on First Nations communities, its paternalistic rather than co-designed application framework, and its very high cost, with some arguing the funding should be diverted to more holistic support programs. A coalition of welfare bodies such as ACOS, many First Nations groups, particularly in the NT, the Australian Greens and other groups, consistently opposed income management. The Labor Party gradually switched from full support for about a decade to qualified support and then to total opposition, at least to the CDC. And in 2022, they fulfilled their election promise as a government to abolish the cashless debit card. But the other forms of welfare quarantining in the NT still remain today. So all four case studies that I've talked about constitute examples of, in my opinion, remarkable policy reform, given that policymakers had to overcome long entrenched policy development structures and frameworks and associated political and ideological justifications and resistance. Now, to be sure, these reforms are not flawless and all require further practice and policy initiatives to enhance their impact and effectiveness. So what were the key factors, or some of the key factors in a short summary, that have informed change? So a crucial enabling force was a dedicated campaign group or coalition that specifically targeted that policy reform and was not diverted by other policy agendas. So a very strong example of that is the Home Stretch campaign that aimed to extend care to 21 in all states and territories. And similarly, having a vocal policy entrepreneur, for example, Paul McDonald of Anglicare Victoria, who's here today, welcome Paul, who headed that campaign, connected to or supporting this coalition, and who was skilled in presenting a persuasive policy narrative at the right time in the political cycle, was really vital to campaign success. Another factor was parliamentary inquiries, which sometimes seemed to be a bit of a slow-moving beast. But they were really effective in providing a public voice for groups critical of the status quo. So equally, having a political champion such as Fiona Patten, the former leader of the Reason Party in the Victorian Parliament Upper House, who was very active in advancing both the leaving care and injecting room reforms, that was really valuable. And equally, lived experience voices were very effective in highlighting the policy concerns in the wider community and media. Research evidence, global and domestic, was influential in all 4 of the case studies in providing advocates with a clear set of alternative policy solutions. Whilst a cost-benefit analysis was often instrumental in clearly demonstrating the economic as well as social benefits of policy change. COVID-19 was a wider factor which informed a more sympathetic political climate in 2 of the case studies, while more discrete factors such as a coroner's report in the injecting room case study and an audit report in the cashless debit card case study also impacted. These suggest that policy advocates need to be very mindful of taking advantage of short-term windows of opportunity. Now, interestingly, some powerful groups in society were not that involved or influential. So, sadly to say, none of the major think tanks of any persuasion had any particular impact on these 4 case studies. Similarly, other than a minor contribution to lifting the job seeker rate, the trade unions were completely passive. Media coverage of all 4 case studies was, however, considerable, but it was arguably not a decisive factor in any of the policy outcomes or change, although I believe it probably helped at the margins to secure an injecting room in Victoria, mainly by the Herald Sun at that time adopting a more of a neutral position and not actively opposing the room. Changed a bit later. And media coverage probably helped in the case of the Homestretch campaign to persuade 1 or 2 recalcitrant state governments, New South Wales and Queensland, let's be blunt, at the end to introduce extended out-of-home care programs by virtue of constantly reporting, well, 6 of the states and territories have this program, it's life-changing, it's preventing youth homelessness, you better get on board. Anyway. Now, while some authors argue that policy reform is more likely to be delivered by bipartisan agreement, my case studies actually suggest that bipartisanship is just as likely to block policy reform. And it was clearly only when Labor governments broke with the coalition at a policy level that the major reforms to introduce an injecting room in Victoria and abolish the cashless debit card federally were implemented. However, an associated argument in favour of conscience votes for members of Parliament definitely has merit. That approach would potentially enable dissidents from the coalition, particularly to consider adopting an evidence-based rather than narrowly conservative approach when deciding their position on issues like injecting rooms, the job seeker rate and conditional welfare measures. With the exception of the leaving care study, it's also notable that all 3 of the other case studies provoked a significant conservative backlash to either resist or roll back the changes. In the injecting room study, opposition from the Conservative Liberal National Coalition in Victoria, sections of the media and some community groups, particularly in the city of Yarra, persuaded the Victorian Labor government to renege on its clear promise to establish a second injecting room in the CBD. In the job seeker case study, I might have already mentioned that the Commonwealth Labor government actually ignored detailed recommendations from its own Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee to introduce a higher job seeker rate. In the income management case study, the Labor government has retained major forms of compulsory income management, particularly in the Northern Territory, despite its election promise to transform all participants to a voluntary opt-in option. These setbacks suggest that advocates who have been successful in advancing policy reforms may need to devise new and different campaign strategies to fortify and expand such reforms once implemented. So, I guess building on the content of the book, what does some of this tell us about policy development processes more broadly? So, in my opinion, there's an obvious need for governments to more actively draw on specialist knowledge and evidence of what works when they commission research reports or evaluation studies or establish advisory boards or committees to review existing policies or consider reform. There's various initiatives they could take to achieve this objective. So one would be require any advisory body to include at least one paid member with lived experience expertise. Notably, the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee did not do that. I believe that was controversial, but anyway, I'll say no more. Number two, require any teams that win research tenders to include at least one person who has a dedicated record of track record of research output in that area. Three, and/or require all research reports to be reviewed by a person who has dedicated research knowledge in that area. Now, the alternative, okay, we can keep doing what we're doing. So, where many research and evaluation studies are conducted by non-specialists who present reports that, again, in my opinion, range from average to very poor quality, because they don't sufficiently engage with existing research evidence and knowledge, either domestic or global. And there have been many such examples in the case studies covered, which you'll read about in the book. There is also the associated problem that many governments cherry pick the research findings that conform with their established policy directions, rather than objectively considering the implications of research findings for their policy making. Now, that practice was particularly annoyingly present in the long-standing debate over the merits of compulsory income management policies. It's unlikely better quality policy development processes and research reports will end such disingenuous practices in itself, but they might at least make governments hesitate for a moment before claiming to know better than researchers who've spent decades studying that particular problem. All right, so to sum up, my book has identified a range of advocacy strategies across 4 divergent case studies that seem to be influential in shifting the dial from policy neglect to policy reform. I hope that those lessons can also be applied to other social policy issues affecting disadvantaged groups and communities. So some of the really obvious ones, the appalling continuing overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in statutory child protection and out-of-home care systems, despite the fact that that became an official closing the gap target 6 years ago in 2019, but all the stats show we're still going backwards. Homelessness, mental health, juvenile crime, and residential and home-based care systems for the elderly. So in all those areas, we clearly urgently need more evidence-based policy reform. So I'll leave it there and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Philip. We're going to move into some Q&A time. So if you have questions for Philip, now is your opportunity. We have Lucas and Kate who are going to be bringing you microphones. Please hold it right up close so that our online audience who are watching the live stream can hear you. If you're at home watching the live stream and you have questions, you can pop them in the YouTube chat and we will try to read them out. First one over here.
Thank you. A fascinating talk. Thank you, Professor. Last week, Victoria saw a massive leap ahead in policy development, and that was agreeing to the treaty between the state government and the First Peoples of Victoria. Massive though that was, I see it as the end result of a very long process. And for me, that takes me all the way back to 1975, Gough Whitlam's passage of the Racial Discrimination Act. A lot has happened between 75 and now, which just makes me think about the processes of change and something that I term strategic incrementalism. So I put it to you, should we seek massive changes in one fell swoop, or should we design processes of getting there bit by bit, strategic incrementalism?
Yeah, well, that is a really good question, and I'm not a great fan of incrementalism, strategic or otherwise. And one of the reasons for that, I guess, particularly if you look at the leaving care journey, that there was a lot of incrementalism which didn't go very far. Yeah, I mean, I sat in Victorian government advisory committees in 1999 where, you know, a big report was prepared for the minister at the minister's request, and we all thought, oh, here we go, we'll have post-care supports till 21 in the next budget, and Victoria didn't universally fund till 2021. 22 years later. And there was very little we knew in 2021 that we didn't know in 1999 or even in 1989, as I mentioned. So, look, I'm not a great fan of it, but I think your example of the treaty is a really interesting one, because when I think of the treaty, I think that could have really, really massive strategic, big implications for child protection and out-of-home care. And my reading of that situation is that the Victorian government were holding off on advancing that treaty to progress really big substantive reforms to decision-making around Aboriginal children, youth in the out-of-home care system in Victoria. So it wouldn't surprise me if within a year or two of that treaty being passed that we do have reforms in Victoria leading the way, well ahead of any other state and territory, where we go down the track of what has been present for a long time in the Indian reservations in the USA, in Canada and parts of New Zealand, where those communities run their own child protection out-of-home care systems under community ownership and control, which, even though we've moved a little bit in that direction in Victoria, we've moved only minimally incrementally, in my opinion. So, yeah, I you know, whether they should have waited or needed to wait or had to wait for that, I'm not sure. There might be lawyers in the room who would say, well, there are certain legal reasons why signing that treaty would help advance and accelerate the policy outcome. But anyway, I think it will promote progress. But good question.
Hi there, afternoon everyone. Thanks, Philip. My respectful quibble could pick up on this strategic incrementalism with your 3 case studies, we'll handle that number 2, but focus on number 3. When you mentioned with the job seeker and you identified the key determining variable as COVID, my respectful quibble is, are you sure it was just COVID, or was it because even the middle class were now rapidly losing their jobs? Suddenly it's far more politically expedient to give everyone a decent living wage.
It's a good question, and look, when I'm talking about COVID, I'm talking about the whole economic and social context of COVID. But I mean, what is interesting in the policy literature, they talk about often a crisis like COVID, or, you know, say a massive tsunami or a cyclone. Be careful if you're going to Darwin. That can be a circuit breaker to inform and advance change. So the interesting thing with COVID is that, excuse me, if you look at the leaving care debate, say in Australia, England and America, in all those countries, during the period of COVID, there were advancements, and the reason for the advancement was that governments believed, for whatever reason, that they could be slightly less worried about budget deficits and they could advance spending, more generous spending, in a way that they might not have contemplated beforehand. So I think that was really the context of COVID. Although, having said that, interestingly, during COVID, the British Prime Minister, or the responsible national minister, said every young person who's in care at 18, we're going to keep funding them while COVID continues. In America, Trump was in his first term. He issued, I can't remember what you call it, like a piece of legislation, all care leavers who are 18 to 21, because America had had extended care for many years, can stay in that housing till the end of COVID. Do you know what Scott Morrison did? Nothing. Nothing at all. So, yep.
Beck, did you have one online?
Yeah, but
Yep, got a few online.
yeah. So firstly, have you noticed a role for staff within organisations being able to influence positive change and inform in their organisations? Thank you. That's from Francis Lynch.
Organisations in a particular area, or like people working in practice roles. Look, let's interpret it as people working practice roles. And look, in all our research projects that have produced evidence that have had policy impact, people working as case managers, as workers in forms of out-of-home care, workers in drug and alcohol space, they've always been really important participants in our projects, really important sources of stakeholder evidence. They're often the people that are closest to the actual service users. So yes, how they do that can often be a little bit challenging, because if they work in government, they're not allowed to express a policy view publicly anyway. If they work for non-government, often they've got a bit more freedom, but often it has been a matter of them expressing their views within policy projects, and then we run with that evidence publicly in the media to government and so on. So yes, I think in those sort of areas, and also the other areas I mentioned at the end, really, really important and valuable contribution. Yeah.
No one else is going to. All right, cool.
Thanks, Phil. A terrific presentation. I'm Peter Fitzgerald. I head the ALP Policy Committee on Justice and Democracy. In the last 8 or 9 days, there have been 5 major reform announcements in relation to juvenile crime. Also, I sit on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Policy Committee as an ally. There was no consultation, despite treaty, despite commitments about voice, before those announcements were made. The packages across the 5 reforms are around about $200 million over 4 years. 70% of them, 70% of the dollars go to extension of prison beds, so 30 beds at Malmesbury Juvenile Centre, minimum security, 30 people, $140 million over 4 years, so about $1 million a year per juvenile. So all the evidence is that most of the juvenile offenders in the police incident reports are known to the police as victims of crime, witnesses of crime, members of the child protection system, out-of-home care. So there's a more complex set of things than what Channel 7 and the Murdoch media would tell us. Yet we're putting all of our dollars into where the evidence says we shouldn't be putting it, rather than the other way. So I'm interested in what lessons you might have for us, or support you might have for us in protection of the vulnerable groups.
It's an area, I guess, we've been engaged with a little bit for more than a decade. We actually did a 3-year project working with the then Victorian Children's Commissioner, Bernie Geary, examining the experiences of young people who at the point of leaving out-of-home care were actually in the youth justice system, particularly in the custodial system. So there is a long history of the fact that probably about half the young people in the youth justice system are also from out-of-home care or have been in out-of-home care at some point, and also about half or more have a First Nations background. You don't need to convince me, Peter, at all. I mean, the evidence is overwhelmingly that if you provide holistic supports, if you provide opportunities, you know, rather than locking people away, and particularly locking people away with more established criminals, you're going to get a better outcome in the long run. But of course, you know, I guess governments have got to deal with community attitudes. They've got to deal with public attitudes. They've got to deal with the media. They've got to deal with what people think is happening, and putting out a more nuanced, evidence-based prevention, social investment approach isn't always that easy to convince the punters of. So, yeah, I just think it won't end well. And I think what's going to happen I actually think probably what will happen with closing the gap, which is not unrelated, because of course it's not only the closing the gap commitment to reducing the number of Aboriginal children going to care, it's also that closing the gap, I think from memory, has commitments around deaths in custody and a whole lot of other areas. And at some point, someone employed in a policy role, probably in Canberra, is going to look at the stats, this is where economists are very important, and suddenly say, okay, well, the 20 Aboriginal people that died in custody were all in out-of-home care, and they're all in the youth justice system. And we're seeing a pattern here that we actually need to do something about to stop the pipeline of them getting into custody and tragically dying. So, I mean, these are things we've known about for 20, 30 years, but eventually someone will blow the lid on it who's got, I guess, an ear to the Prime Minister, and suddenly everything will change.
Hello, Bruce Hartnett. I just want to run a counter to what John just said in relation to the reforms that the Victorian government just introduced, to say it's contrary to the evidence. 2 bits of evidence. There's been a 10% reduction in those crimes in Queensland in just 12 months after they, whereas in Victoria we've had a 40% increase in car thefts and burglaries and home invasions in the last 12 months. If you give people bail, as Victoria has been doing, they go out and commit more crimes. The evidence is clearly there, and they have to commit about 10 crimes before they get rearrested a second time. The ratio of crimes committed to arrests is about 10 to 1. And if they're in jail for a long period, they're not committing crimes. It makes the community safer. So I don't think the Victorian government is responding just to the public pressure. I think they're responding to some realities which they haven't faced up to, and which, frankly, the left is blinkered because they don't want to face that evidence. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bruce. Well, you know, I don't think, I can hear people murmuring, but I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction between the two positions, because they're two different forms of evidence. And governments do have to protect the community, there's no doubt about that. So how they reconcile those different forms of evidence, I think, can be the challenge. Maybe you should ask a question together.
Thank you, Philip, for your presentation and indeed all your work over many years. My question is really about human rights. Australia is the only member of the OECD and one of the only, or perhaps the only, developed country that doesn't have a human rights charter or human rights act. 3 states, including Victoria, have human rights legislation, but it doesn't include all human rights, and it certainly doesn't include all human rights relating to children and young people. My question to you is, what impact, if any, do you think having a human rights, an overarching human rights act might have in being able to pursue policy change, for example, in the cases that you've studied in detail?
Penny, I'm probably going to disappoint you by saying I think not a lot. And one of the reasons for that is that even national, state or territory legislation is often not that important or influential or key. So interestingly, in the extended care, and this is a discussion Paul McDonald and I have often had, we don't have legislation in Victoria anywhere. There was a bill that got put up in the Parliament and it got postponed and it never actually got passed. But we've got on the ground, we've got funding, we've got policies, we've got supports, we've got about 200 workers in Victoria now paid to work with vulnerable young people, 18 or 16 and 21 in extended care programs, all without any legislation. So if we'd waited for the legislation, who knows? Now, I was around back in 2005 when they passed the Children and Young Persons Act in Victoria. You know, wonderful piece of legal addition, which had a bit in it about, you know, young people are in, I think it said something like young people are entitled to support until they're 21, but then it had a caveat. And the caveat was clearly written by a very astute lawyer. And PhD student of mine at the time who did complete his PhD on leaving care, he wrote to the Victorian Government Department and said, what is the purpose of this caveat? Because it seems to cancel and contradict. And this person deliciously, without feeling inhibited, wrote back and said, it's there because otherwise we're concerned that young people will use the other bit to sue the government. And I didn't put this in the book because I thought it was just so lowbrow, and I don't think that person's there, and I wouldn't have named him, but you know, I just thought I don't want to embarrass but yeah.
This next question is from Grandpa J online.
Oh.
Specialist knowledge may influence the government, but how do you bring the wider voting public along with it?
Which is a really, really good question. And again, in the leaving care area, the very interesting bit has been that when you talk to people in the wider community, and I've been doing this for minimum 20 years, and you know, even the wonderful Rotary Club of Melbourne funded a leaving care housing program at one point about a decade or so ago, you know, and people like me thinking, you know, Rotary Club, you know, how are they going to connect, you know, to vulnerable group? But they were just incredibly insightful. They got PwC involved and a whole lot of other big firms in a pro bono way, and a whole lot of these people would come to meetings, really corporate people, and the minute you said to them, oh, young people in care lose all their funding at 18 or in many cases a year younger, they looked at you and said, oh my God, I never knew that if I'd known that, you know, and my family and my friends would all say that is so unacceptable. So it often is networking, it is about getting it out in the media, but yeah, you know, I've met people over the years, particularly the cashless debit card, and people say, oh, I vote Liberal, and you know, the minister said, you know, the minister quoted the evaluation report. It says, cash debit card is wonderful, it's helping people, you know, and it's sort of like, well, yeah, how do you contest that and reverse it and convert people? And it's not easy. But I think probably of the 4 case studies, the leaving care one is the easier one in that regard anyway, because there's very few people. I think a journalist in The Age once called them monsters, anyone who would argue that young people leaving care, given all their vulnerability, shouldn't get supported to 21. Whereas on the other 3 case studies, you're going to get a lot of division.
Can I be selfish because I have the microphone in hand? I'm Kate, I'm the Director of the Centre for Equitable Housing at Capita. We're doing a project on permanent supportive housing at the moment, and this notion that people should be supported into housing without eligibility requirements around substance use, things like that. And it strikes me there's a lot of analogies with the safe injecting facility in Melbourne, and I'm wondering if you have any insights into that ideology piece or the advocacy piece around how you bring along hearts and minds and broader considerations around harm reduction and the argument for something like harm reduction in housing.
I think it's always about finding the right language and the right strategies that demonstrate the community that you're aiming to lift people up. You're aiming to give people opportunities. In regards to the injecting room, even people often talk about, well, you know, so-and-so through the injecting room connected to a service that helped him or her get secure housing, and then they went back and studied and or got employment. So the community want to hear that there'll be some positive outcome, that it's not, you know, those bleeding heart welfare people that are handing out handouts to undeserving people. It's always going to be hard to make an argument to the average punter in the community about structural causes or systemic causes. You know, there's 100 pages of that in the book, but the average person wants to hear, okay, well, if you give that person housing, if you give them supports, how will that help them? How will that help ensure that they will then actually take advantage of that to lift their own life opportunities and their life chances? And that, you know, that is the challenging area, to be able to couch that, to frame it in a way that the average person in the community can relate to and think, well, if that was my son or daughter or my cousin or even my parent, that's what I would like to be happening for them.
Thank you, Philip. My name's Stan Cap, and thank you for reminding me of the scars on my back from advocating an opinion piece in the Herald Sun for an injection room in the CBD. I think it might be the only positive piece that was written for some years on that matter. I'm continually frustrated with the inability of government to make hard decisions. And I think one of the reasons for that is that they never quite know which side of the fence the community is going to support. There are many jurisdictions in the world that have adopted people's panels, and I think of Ireland in this respect, where people's panels or citizens' juries have been established to look at wicked problems. Most of the issues you've got up are wicked problems that governments really grapple with. And I just wonder whether there isn't a mechanism that we could introduce into Australia whereby we have the standing committees, as they do in Dublin, about wicked problems that can actually look at, research, get the best advice from both sides of the argument and come up with a decision. I think there are some very good examples of that internationally, and in the absence of government being prepared to make tough decisions like a CBD-based injection room, as an example, I think this might be worth progressing. I'd be interested in your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. And I do remember that piece because it got quoted in a study of media reporting of the injecting room debate. And my co-author got you confused with Sally Capita at one point, which won't look, I think any forums, any avenues for advancing evidence-based policy debate free of party, political, partisan, self-interested, whatever agendas would be great. I mean, it always interests me that in Switzerland, which, I think most people would say is a fairly conservative country, they agreed decades ago to go down the harm reduction path. They had a big national referendum, and that referendum voted overwhelmingly for prescribed heroin, for registered addicts, for injecting rooms. So if they can do that, why can't we? I'm sure there would be other examples as you gave. I think, I find the party political debates very frustrating for a whole range of reasons. I mean, we can go into it, we wouldn't have time, but even in Victoria, the fact that you can't have a debate in Parliament on the injecting room or rooms with any coalition members saying, yes, we support that, because we know privately a number of them do. And the fact that Evan Mulholland, that worked for IPA, who's now in Parliament, who you would expect as a libertarian to absolutely support an injecting room, sort of supported an injecting room in the last parliamentary debate. I think that's in the book. Suggests there's probably 5 or 10 other people in that Liberal Party caucus that do support it, but why can't they say that, given that, as I said earlier, it was actually a coalition government in New South Wales that made it permanent?
I think we might be out of time, but please join me in thanking Philip. Thank you so much again, Philip.
My pleasure.
If you would like to purchase Philip's book, you can head to the Emerald Publishing website, which is bookstore.emerald.com. And for a 30% discount, you can use the code EME30 at the checkout. This was our final John Cain lunch for the year. We'll be back from February next year. Thank you so much for all of your support throughout the year. We will have a 2025 impact report coming out soon, so keep an eye on your inboxes for that. If you are not currently subscribed to our per capita newsletter, you can sign up on our website. But until next year, have a wonderful holiday season and a very happy new year. Thanks, everyone.